There really was something odd about this machine and how it came to be. I started off with a motherboard, which I got on a whim just because it was convenient. I was picking up some RAM and the board was just there, so even though I didn't have any clue what I was going to do with it, I knew I wanted it. Next, I decided to go for a 1080 Ti and put together a system around that. Considering that there is a 1060 on the table, that didn't pan out. I actually did test it in its original planned configuration, but the 8500 did not leave any CPU overhead for stuff like game recording without bottlenecking the 1080 Ti, so I decided to go with a lower tier card. It just seemed a lot more appropriate that way. On the table in front of me I've got the Z370 board and 16 gigs of 3200 Mbps memory that for once we can take advantage of on an Intel system because we're using the Z board. Alongside that and the pre-installed CPU we've got the 256GB NVMe SSD and a very fiddly cooler bracket that needs to be pre-attached. Because the GPU that we are going to be using today is a blower style card that are not known for being the quietest design, it was only fitting to give it a leg up by reducing noise as much as possible. The 240mm Corsair H100i AIO barely runs its fans to keep the CPU below 65C in Cinebench, so that is a win. I proceeded then to spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to get the cooler situated on top of the alpha cooled something or other case, with one of the screws giving me proper grief, and after swearing a lot I realized that all that effort was for naught because the cooler would interfere with the motherboard, preventing it from being installed. Bummer. Really is a shame because there is a dust filter on top and with the fans positioned to blow inwards it would have made cleaning this PC a lot easier, but we shall have to settle it with being in front. I had to use one of those universal backplates for the motherboard because the original one was lost, but I think it turned out very well regardless. Next comes fastening the board in place in preparation for the cooler installation. After a quick squirt of MX5 thermal paste, the cooler goes on and it's starting to look rather good. I had to fiddle my way with installing the Corsair link cable. Normally I would not bother, but because the H100i has RGB and it defaults to yellow, I think it was the right decision. I also pre-installed the PSU, which in this case is an excellent 500 watt Cooler Master unit that I really like because it has flat matte cables. Unlike the cheaper aesthetically similar units like the Cylon, it's actually a decent PSU. And finally, after all of that, the GPU goes in. Not the most exciting card in the world, but competent nonetheless. I have a separate teardown video of this card, so keep an eye out for that. Because I built a few 1060 machines already, this time I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction and overclock it with a more detailed explanation in the benchmarking section. Before all that, let's have a look at the finished product. I would say that it is a good looking mid-range machine. I even found the time to install some light strips that I knew were heavily tinted blue when set to white, so I chose a light up blue fan to complement. First off the bat is heaven, and the vanilla 1060 would normally post an average frame rate of about 103 with good frame time spacing. But because I overclocked it just a touch, the average went all the way up to 110 FPS. The power draw doesn't really change that much, so neither do the thermals or the noise levels. In my opinion, it should be the default to put about 130 MHz on the core and about 220 Mbps on the memory. I have alluded to this in previous PC build videos, but I never posted a full benchmark run with the card running in excess of its factory default. If this isn't your thing and you want to see the vanilla performance, then I suggest any one of my previous builds with the 1060. Them until now have been very well balanced and always the card has been the bottleneck. And yes, I am aware that you can push the clocks a lot higher, but this is a blower style card and I don't want to make it unbearably loud or pseudo stable. In Superposition, which is much newer benchmark when compared to Heaven, we see a very respectable 50 FPS on average at 1080p high. Not a lot to say about it really, except that we see a 3% on average frame rate uplift from overclocking the GPU. Not amazing, but free performance is always welcome. Rocket League is essentially a CPU benchmark at this point, as any DGPU that still has driver support will do a decent job here. The 1060 is no exception, posting an average of 348 FPS with all the settings turned all the way up, making this machine good enough even for enthusiasts. The overclock probably accounted for some of that, but a lot was down to the CPU. Intel chips usually do quite well in this game. Fortnite, with everything turned to epic, stays mostly around 60 FPS, with a few dips here and there that are characteristic of this game. Frame time spikes in my observation across multiple systems are caused a lot more frequently by the CPU rather than the GPU, and because the 8500 is no slouch, unless you look at the frame time graph, you will not notice them. That being said, I think most people would do the sensible thing of dropping down to medium settings without resolution scaling and epic draw distance and have themselves a 144 FPS plus experience. If there is a case here for going down to low settings or performance mode, I honestly can't see it. I left Warzone to its own devices to select the settings its devs feel are most appropriate for the configuration, and they are clearly geared towards a 60 FPS experience. Fortunately, I don't habitually play this title and I do not feel brave enough to go online playing through the capture card on OBS, and I don't want to hinder other players, so that is why you see me playing the tutorial. I assure you the performance is indicative of normal gameplay. I don't really agree with some of the graphical choices and I think it can be optimized a lot more, but even if you do skip fiddling with the settings, you will have a decent experience. Horizon Zero Dawn is a funny one that oscillates between putting pressure on the GPU and on the CPU, but overall it always does remarkably well with decent frame times on most configurations I've tested. This time is no exception, going from an expected 58 FPS to a psychologically important 61 FPS on average, without the help from our very mild overclock. Just remember that this is a benchmark run at favor quality settings, so in gameplay the averages will be considerably higher. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, using the high settings we get a very respectable 52 FPS on average, and while there are some frame time spikes, they are not egregious. It's easy enough to tweak the settings and get better visuals with 60 FPS plus on average, an idiosyncrasy of this game, but for the benchmarks I prefer to stick with the presets wherever possible. Considering that the benchmark is a kind of worst case scenario and the game is mainly based around exploration, I think no matter what settings you choose, you will end up having a good gameplay experience at 1080p. I mean, sure, you can play Days Gone using the very high preset, but I have no idea why you would want to, considering it will be running at around 50-ish FPS instead of the more fluid 70 on high with virtually no loss in graphical fidelity. I only recommend going for very high in this title if you are already getting over 70 FPS and don't have a high refresh rate monitor, in which case it kind of makes sense as the fluidity won't be impacted at all. In this particular situation, I think I will take the extra 20 FPS when trying to give the slip to a horde. I'm still bummed about Far Cry 6 being such a CPU single core and frequency limited game, but there is a silver lining in the form of its Fidelity FX implementation. I feel that the minor shimmering artifacts when enabled are way preferable to having lower settings, especially on resolutions beyond Full HD. Don't get me wrong, I'm not recommending anyone run performance mode unless they really have to, but ultra quality makes the difference between 40 FPS on average and 60 FPS on average with more consistent frame times, so I see this as a win with little to no downsides. In Cyberpunk, you actually have a few options and you can choose how to play it. Ultra is doable with dynamic resolution, but I find it too soft and I don't really like it. Enabling the dynamic resolution frame rate target completely pushes the frame rate into the mid-30s, which isn't great. I cycled to the presets a couple of times and I think I'll probably go with the high preset for the entire playthrough with the dynamic resolution minimum set to 90. It's not a locked 60 FPS experience, but it's not miles away. The most important aspect being that it is very smooth with no noticeable frame time spikes. The fact that you can tweak the game to your liking instead of just relying on the low or medium preset is a boon in my book, so I'll call this a good experience. That's it for this video. Thank you very much for sticking around until the end and have a great day.